She wore steel-toed boots to work, collected garbage before the sun came up, and came home to a house the city had already scheduled to tear down. He wore tailored suits, ran a company worth $800 million, and had not slept a full night in 5 years. Zora had been awake since 4. Not because an alarm went off. She had stopped setting alarms after the first week. Her body had learned the route the way bodies learn things they are made to repeat. It woke itself up, swung its own legs over the edge of the bed, and put its own feet on the cold hardwood floor. She dressed in the dark. Work pants, long-sleeved shirt, thick socks. She sat on the edge of the bed and laced up her boots, heavy, steel-toed, mud-caked from yesterday, and she did it without thinking, one lace then the other, the way her mother had taught her to do hard things. One step at a time, not the whole thing, just the next step. She was 18 years old. Before she pulled on her vest, she went to the kitchen and ate 4 crackers with peanut butter standing at the counter. That was breakfast. That was most mornings. The peanut butter was almost gone. She would need another jar by Thursday, which meant managing the envelope carefully this week. The envelope lived in the bottom of her boot bag. Whatever was left after the power bill and the water bill she had been paying under the previous account number, the one she still remembered from childhood, the one she had given the tired man on the phone when she first moved in and he had restored the power without asking a single question she could not answer. She had been afraid he would ask questions. He had not. She ate the 4 crackers. She drank water from the tap. She pulled on her orange vest and picked up her gloves from the desk. Her hands, even gloved, still carried a smell at the end of shift that no amount of washing fully removed, something metallic and organic and specific to the work. She had gotten used to it. You got used to most things if they were the price of staying. Then she stopped. On the windowsill, the bracelet was catching the first gray light of morning the way it always did. Gold. Thin. A single word engraved in French. She did not wear it to work. She left it on the windowsill where she could see it every morning when she woke up and every evening when she came home. A compass point, the one object she owned that said, "You came from somewhere. You were someone's daughter." That is still true. She went downstairs and walked out into the dark. Her route that morning took her through the central business district. She moved fast, the way you move when your body knows the work before your mind does. Bins outside restaurants. Loading docks behind office towers. The glass buildings along the waterfront are just beginning to catch the early light. She was on her 3rd block when she stopped. A building on the corner. 14 floors. Glass and steel. And above the entrance, in brushed metal letters she had now passed 3 times on this route without being able to simply pass. Tureaud Energy Group. Her father's name. On the side of a building. $800 million of everything he had built while she was gone. While she was in Canada eating dinner in a small house outside Toronto pretending to be someone the world did not know existed. While she was learning to answer to a different name. While she was sitting beside her mother's hospital bed in the last 3 months watching a woman get smaller and quieter until one morning she did not open her eyes. She had come back to this city with nothing. No money. No plan. No documentation. She had come back because when her mother died and she stood in that small house asking herself, where do you go when the last person who knew you were alive was gone? The answer was not complicated. It was just a street. A white house on a street in this city, with a porch swing and a creak on the 3rd stair. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at his name. Without deciding to, her hand moved to the front pocket of her vest, where the bracelet was not because she never brought it to work because it stayed on the windowsill and found nothing. Her hand came back empty. She stood there for 8 seconds. She thought about the 14 floors, the glass, the brushed metal letters, the man somewhere inside that building who had stood at a graveside with her name on it and had not known he was grieving something still alive. She did not step toward the building. She picked up the next bag and kept moving. That particular Tuesday in October, Carver was in the back of his car being driven across the city for a reason he had been telling himself was practical. His project manager, a man named Dale, had left 3 messages about the Audubon Street property. The demolition company needed final confirmation before they moved the crew. The buyers for the commercial development were getting impatient. Everything was ready to proceed. He just needed to walk the property one last time, sign the authorization, and let 5 years of a locked door become a gas station. It was good business. Smart business. That was what he had been telling himself for 3 weeks since he signed the initial demolition papers. Lazette had agreed with him, had encouraged him, actually, in that quiet, measured way she had. She said it was time. She said holding on to the past was not healthy. She said turning the property into something productive was exactly the kind of forward thinking that had made him successful. She had said all of this at dinner one evening while Gordon ate his food beside her, and Carver had nodded and thought, yes, you are right, and had called Dale the following morning. He looked out the window as the city changed around him. The central business district gave way to the garden district, then further, into older neighborhoods where the houses were smaller and the live oaks stretched their arms over the streets like they owned them. A woman swept her front porch. 2 boys argued over a bicycle on the sidewalk. A man carried groceries in plastic bags that cut into his fingers. Life moving in its ordinary way, indifferent to whatever any individual person was carrying inside them. Carver's driver, Jones, said nothing. He had worked for Carver for 4 years and he was good at silence. They turned onto Audubon Street. Carver felt his hands go cold before his mind caught up with why. He knew this street. He knew the way the houses sat slightly back from the sidewalk here, the way the trees arched overhead, the way the light came through in the afternoon in long golden pieces. He had driven through this neighborhood 1,000 times when Zora was small. He knew every block. He had just not been here in 5 years because the version of himself that could handle being here had not existed in 5 years. The car slowed. There it was. He had not prepared himself adequately for what it would do to him, seeing it again. The house was white or had been white, though the paint had gone to a tired gray at the edges where the weather had worked on it for years. The garden along the front fence had grown wild, the way things grow when no one is tending them, full of the determined chaos of plants that answer to nothing. The porch swing was still there, one chain slightly lower than the other, the way it had always been. He had always meant to fix that. He had always meant to fix a lot of things. Jones put the car in park. Carver sat. He was aware of being unable to move. This was not a feeling he was accustomed to. He was a man who made decisions in seconds and acted on them without hesitation. He did not sit in the back of cars unable to move. And yet here he was. A specific memory arrived without asking permission. Zora, at 11 years old, sitting on that porch swing on a Saturday afternoon with a book open in her lap, her feet not quite reaching the ground, the white streak in her hair bright in the afternoon sun. She had been humming something he could not identify. He had watched her from the front walk for almost a full minute before she heard him and looked up and smiled. It was not a dramatic memory. It was not the kind of memory you would tell someone about. But it was the one that lived closest to the surface, the one that had been with him every morning for 5 years when he opened his eyes and remembered what was gone. He got out of the car. The air smelled like October in New Orleans, which is its own specific thing, warm still but with the first suggestion of something cooler underneath, the city exhaling after the long brutal summer. He stood on the sidewalk looking at the house for a moment. Then he walked toward it. The front gate opened with the same creak it had always had. He stopped. The weeds along the front path had been pressed down. Not overgrown in the undisturbed way everything else was overgrown. Pressed down repeatedly in a narrow line from the gate to the porch steps. Like someone had been walking this path. Regularly. Recently. He frowned. Probably kids cutting through the yard. Probably nothing. He told himself this and believed it partially and walked to the front door. The key was in his inside jacket pocket. He had not put it on his keyring in 5 years. He kept it separate in a small envelope in his desk drawer, and he had taken it out this morning and put it in his pocket and told himself it was just in case. He was just being practical. The lock turned. The door swung open. He reached for the light switch out of pure muscle memory. He had cut the electricity off years ago. His hand moved to the switch anyway and flipped it. The light came on. Carver went very still. The electricity was not supposed to be on. He looked at the switch. He looked at the ceiling fixture. The light was on. Someone had restored the electricity to this house. He stood in the doorway and looked at the front room. Everything was as he had left it 5 years ago. The furniture, the bookshelves, the framed photographs on the walls, but with something layered over the stillness. the specific quality of air in a space that is being lived in. A blanket on the armchair that had not been there before. Worn soft from use, folded with care. A pair of running shoes by the door, small, a woman's size, with red mud on the soles that was still slightly damp. He moved slowly into the house. In the kitchen, 2 dishes sat drying in the rack beside the sink. 1 plate, 1 glass. On the counter near the window, 3 things arranged in a neat line. A box of crackers. A jar of peanut butter. A small cup that held 2 spoons. He stood looking at those 2 spoons for a long time without fully understanding why they were affecting him the way they were. He moved to the hallway. Near the base of the stairs there was a pair of heavy work boots. The kind with steel reinforcement in the toe. They were scuffed and mud-caked at the sole, and they were small, much too small for a man, the right size for a young woman. On the floor beside them, neatly folded, a reflective orange vest. The kind worn by sanitation crews. He understood then that this was not kids cutting through the yard. Someone was living here. He stood at the base of the stairs and looked up. The house was quiet. Whoever was here was not here now. He thought about calling out and did not. He thought about leaving and could not. Some pull he could not name was drawing him up those stairs, and he had stopped fighting pulls. He could not name somewhere around year 3 of the grief when he ran out of energy for resistance. He climbed the stairs. The landing. The hallway. 3 doors. The first door, the small bedroom at the end of the hall, stood open. He could see from where he stood that it was empty, undisturbed. The second door, the bathroom, slightly ajar. Nothing unusual. The third door. Zora's bedroom. He had not been able to think about this door directly in 5 years. He had approached it in his mind 1,000 times and turned away every time because whatever was on the other side of it in his imagination was too much. Too many mornings. Too many homework battles and too many goodnight conversations and too many moments of ordinary fatherhood that he had not known were the best moments of his life until they were over. The door was not fully closed. A sliver of light at the edge. He pushed it open. The room was not empty. Someone had been living in it. The bed was made, not carelessly but with deliberate neatness. The blanket smooth and tight at the corners. On the small desk sat a notebook, closed, and a pen. A jacket hung on the back of the chair, dark blue, worn at the elbows. On the wall beside the window, 3 photographs had been pinned up, small, printed on regular paper. He moved closer to look at them. The first photograph was of a woman he recognized, even after years, even in age. Celestine. She was standing in front of a house he did not know, somewhere in what looked like winter, snow on the ground, and she was smiling at whoever was holding the camera. She looked older than he remembered her, quieter, but she was smiling. The second photograph was of an elderly woman he did not recognize. Dark-skinned, white-haired, small and upright in the way of people who have spent a lifetime carrying themselves with dignity. She was sitting on a porch somewhere, and she was looking at the camera with an expression he could not fully read but that contained something like peace. The third photograph was of no one. It was a picture of this house. This exact house. Taken from the front walk, in the daytime, the porch swing visible and the overgrown garden and the tired paint. Someone had stood on the sidewalk of this street and taken a photograph of this house and pinned it to the wall of this room like a compass point. Like a destination. He turned from the photographs. On the windowsill, catching the October light, was a bracelet. Carver Tureaud had not cried in 5 years. He had decided, at some point in the first year after the funeral, that he was finished with crying, not out of strength but out of necessity. He had a company to run. He had people whose livelihoods depended on him. He had a wife and a son and a life that required him to be present and functional and forward-facing. And so he had put crying away the way you put away things you cannot afford to keep accessible. He was not able to keep it away now. He reached for the back of the desk chair. His legs had made a unilateral decision about their continued reliability, and he needed something to hold. The bracelet was gold, thin, with a small engraved panel on the top face. The engraving was a single word in French. The Tureaud family word, passed from his grandmother to his mother to him, and from him to exactly one person in this world. He had clasped it on a tiny wrist in a hospital room on a morning, He remembered with a clarity that no amount of grief had been able to erode. He was still holding the back of the chair when he heard the front door open downstairs. He did not move. Footsteps on the hardwood below. Moving through the kitchen. The sound of the refrigerator opening and closing. Then the footsteps at the bottom of the stairs, moving upward slowly. The specific exhaustion in each step of someone who has been on their feet since before the sun came up. The footsteps reached the landing. Turned toward the bedroom. Stopped. He was standing in the doorway. She was standing in the hallway. And for a moment that contained several lifetimes, neither of them moved. He saw the white streak first. It was above her left ear, the same position as his, the same width, the same bright contrast against her dark hair. It was genetic and unmistakable and impossible to be anything other than what it was. His mother had it. He had it. And now it was standing in the hallway of his daughter's old bedroom on the face of a young woman. He did not know and absolutely knew simultaneously. Then he saw her face. And Carver Tureaud, who had run a company worth $800 million and had not broken in 5 years of grief and had told himself on the drive over that this was just a practical errand. A business decision, a forward-thinking move. Carver Tureaud completely came apart. He said her name. That was all. Just her name. Zora. In a voice that did not belong to a CEO or a billionaire or a man in a press suit. In a voice that belonged to a father who had been standing at the edge of an impossible loss for 5 years and had just been pulled back from it without any warning at all. Zora did not move. She stood in the hallway in her work clothes, orange vest over a dark shirt, her hair pulled back except for the streak, and she looked at him with an expression he could not read. It was not the expression he would have imagined. In the 1,000 times he had allowed himself the dangerous luxury of imagining this moment. It was not a relief. It was not the collapse of a child running to her father. It was careful, watchful, the expression of someone who had learned that trust was a door you did not open for anyone until you knew with certainty what was standing on the other side. She was 18 years old and she had survived alone, and survival had made her careful in ways he did not yet understand but was beginning to. The silence between them lasted longer than any silence should. Then she said, quietly and without drama, "I did not think you would come back to this house." He said, "How?" Just that word. His voice barely working. She said, "I will explain everything. But first I need you to answer something." He waited. She said, "I need to know if you knew. If you knew what happened to me and let it happen anyway." The question landed on him with full weight and he understood immediately what she was asking and what the answer meant to her. She was not asking out of accusation. She was asking because she had spent 5 years not knowing, and because the answer to this question determined everything that happened next between them. Whether he was safe. Whether this door was worth opening. He told her the truth. He told her he had been told she died. He told her about the funeral, the closed casket, the specific devastation of standing at a grave with your daughter's name on it and having no reason to question it because the people telling you it was true were the people you trusted most. He told her about the 5 years after, not to defend himself or to solicit sympathy, because she had asked him for the truth and she deserved it without any decoration. She listened. She watched his face while he spoke, and he understood that she was reading him. She was not simply hearing his words. She was measuring them against something. Against the question she had been carrying, he realized. The question of who he was when nobody was performing for him. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "My mother died 3 months ago. In Canada. I did not know where else to go." He heard the word mother and something moved through him. He asked about Celestine. His voice was different now. Softer. Carrying something he had never let himself carry before because carrying it would have meant admitting things about choices he had made and their consequences. Zora told him Celestine had died in October. Quietly. In a small house outside Toronto. She had been sick for 2 years and had not told Zora how sick until near the end. He sat down on the floor. Not on the bed. Not on the chair. The floor. Because his legs had decided they were finished and the floor was what was available. He sat there in his suit on the floor of his daughter's old bedroom, and he did not perform anything. He just sat with it. Zora looked at him on the floor. Her expression changed. Not softening exactly. More like recalibration. She had expected something else, perhaps. Some management of the moment. Some performance of composure. She had not expected the floor. She came and sat across from him. Not close. Not yet. The distance between them was not hostility. It was the appropriate caution of someone who had survived by measuring distances carefully. He did not try to close the distance. He did not reach for words or explanations or anything that would have made this easier on himself. He just sat there on the floor of her old bedroom in his expensive suit with his hands open on his knees and said nothing. He was not managing the moment. He did not know how to manage this particular moment. That was visible on his face in a way he could not have hidden even if he had tried. She watched him not trying. She held out her wrist. The bracelet caught the light. He reached toward it without deciding to. His hand moved on its own, the way hands move toward things they recognize. He stopped just before touching it. He looked up at her, and his eyes were not the eyes of a man performing grief. They were the eyes of a man who had been performing everything else for 5 years and had just run out of the ability to do it. She nodded. He touched the bracelet. His hands remembered it before his mind caught up. The weight of it. The specific temperature of the metal. He had clasped this bracelet on a wrist so small it barely seemed real, in a hospital room on a morning 18 years ago when everything in the world was possible and he had not yet made the choices that would reduce it. He remembered the way she had grabbed his finger without opening her eyes. He had not cried in 5 years. He was wrong about being finished with crying. They sat together on the floor of the room for a long time without speaking. Outside, New Orleans went about its afternoon. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower. Somewhere further, music. The world completely indifferent to the specific private earthquake happening inside this one room. Finally, he asked her to tell him what happened. She told him some of it. She told him that someone in his household had found out about a plan to hurt her. She told him that this person had risked everything to save her. She told him she had been taken to her mother in Canada. She told him about 5 years in a small house outside Toronto, going to school under a different name, learning to be someone the world did not know existed. She did not tell him who saved her. Not yet. She was still deciding how much to give him, and he understood this on some level and did not push. He asked her one question, not about the details, not about who or what or why. One question. He asked her what she needed. She looked at the bracelet on her wrist. Then she looked at him, this man who had been a shape in her imagination for 5 years, a presence she had measured and evaluated from a distance, a father she had watched from across streets and parking lots, trying to determine whether he was worth the risk of being found. She said, "I need to know if you are going to choose the truth when it comes out, even if it costs you everything." He asked her what she meant. She said, "When you find out who did this to me, it is going to break something in your life. Something you built. I need to know before that happens whether you are the kind of man who does the right thing when the right thing is expensive." He looked at his daughter. He looked at the white streak in her hair and the bracelet on her wrist and the careful watchfulness in her eyes that had not been there when she was 13 and that he understood was the cost of 5 years of surviving alone. He said, "Tell me everything." And she did. She started with Miss Cleo Marble. She said the name quietly and without fanfare, and he did not recognize it immediately, and then he did. An elderly woman. Small and upright and white-haired and dignified in the specific way of people who have never had much and have always kept their dignity anyway. She had worked in his household for 4 years. She had come to him through an agency, and she had been quiet and capable and present in the way good household staff are present. Reliably, invisibly, without demanding acknowledgement for the specific miracle of showing up every day and doing the work. He had not thought about Miss Cleo Marble in 5 years. He thought about her now. Zora told him what Miss Cleo Marble had been before she came to work in his house. A midwife, 31 years in a hospital on the east side of New Orleans, delivering babies and keeping people alive and carrying the specific knowledge of the human body that comes only from decades of working at the exact boundary between life and death. She had retired from the hospital and become a household maid because she needed work and it was available, and she was not the kind of woman who sat still. She told him that Miss Cleo Marble had discovered a plot against her life. She told him about the substance. About Lazette finding the will in his wardrobe and doing the arithmetic and making a calculation so cold it made Zora's chest beat 2 times faster any time she thought about it. About Lazette giving Miss Cleo Marble the substance and telling her to put it in Zora's food. She told him that Miss Cleo Marble had switched it. She had replaced whatever Lazette gave her with something harmless and said nothing and gave nothing away and gone about her work as if she had been asked to do nothing more extraordinary than clean a kitchen. And then she had begun to plan. She told him about Miss Cleo Marble using her retired midwife's knowledge to simulate the symptoms of death in a young girl. Slowed breathing, weak pulse, specific and convincing and enough to satisfy the doctor who had been paid to certify what Lazette needed certified. She told him about a retired doctor from Miss Cleo Marble's former hospital. About a phone call made in secret. About an agreement reached between 2 old people who had spent their professional lives deciding that every life was worth the effort of saving. About the night they removed her from the mortuary before the burial and the specific terrifying silence of that drive. The girl barely conscious, the old woman holding her hand and telling her she was going to be all right. She told him about being taken to the airport. About Miss Cleo Marble pressing an envelope into her hand. Everything she had saved, which was not much but was everything. And telling her that her mother was waiting and that she was going to be safe and that she should not come back until she was old enough to protect herself. She told him that Miss Cleo Marble had then returned to his house and cooked breakfast the following morning. She had served Lazette coffee and eggs and said nothing. She had attended the funeral. She had stood at the graveside with the rest of the household staff and mourned publicly the death she had privately prevented. And she had continued to work in that house for 2 more years before her health declined and she retired, and she had died without telling anyone. Without a thank you or a recognition or a single acknowledgement that she had done one of the most extraordinary things one human being can do for another. She had saved a child's life at the cost of everything. And she had never asked for anything in return. Carver had not spoken for a long time. When Zora finished, he was looking at the window, at the October light coming through, at the small photograph of an elderly white-haired woman sitting on a porch with an expression that contained something like peace. He said her name, just that, Miss Cleo Marble, in the way you say the name of someone who deserved more than the world gave them. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. Then he said, "Who gave her the substance?" Zora looked at him. She had been waiting for this question. She had been watching him since she came up those stairs, measuring him against the question of who he was when the performance was stripped away. She had watched him sit on the floor. She had watched him touch the bracelet with hands that remembered. She had watched him listen to Miss Cleo Marble's story without flinching or deflecting or reaching for comfort. She had made her decision. She said, "It was Lazette." He did not explode. He did not deny it. He did not reach for the comfortable alternatives. "Surely you are mistaken. Surely there is another explanation. Surely the woman I have been sleeping beside for 6 years did not look me in the face every day knowing my daughter was alive." He sat with it. She watched him process the arithmetic of it. Lazette finding the will. Lazette seeing the 95% allocation. Lazette being pregnant with Gordon. Lazette handing an elderly woman a substance intended to kill a child. Lazette holding his hand at the graveside of the empty coffin. Lazette's 6 years of dinners and conversations and bed and business decisions and the raising of a son together. All of it built on top of a thing she had done and never confessed and never would have confessed if this morning had not happened. He asked Zora one question. Quiet. Specific. He asked her if she was certain. She told him what Miss Cleo Marble had told her. The specific details that left no room. The substance and the switch and the coordination with the doctor and the specific words Lazette had used when she gave Miss Cleo Marble the instructions. Details that could not be invented. Details that only someone who had been there could know. He nodded once. Then his phone rang. He looked at it. Dale. His project manager. He answered it because something told him to. Dale said, "Mr. Tureaud, I've been trying to reach you. I wanted to confirm. The demolition crew is scheduled for tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. Ms. Lazette called this morning and said you wanted to move the date up. She said you wanted it done before the end of the week. We've got the crew confirmed. Everything is ready to go. Just wanted to make sure you're still good to proceed. Carver went completely still. He looked at Zora. She had heard. The phone was close enough and the house quiet enough, and Dale spoke clearly. He looked at his daughter's face, at the 3 photographs on the wall, at the 2 spoons in the cup on the kitchen counter downstairs, at the worn blue jacket on the back of the chair, at the bracelet on her wrist. He looked at the house his daughter had come back to when she had nowhere else to go. The house she had chosen out of everything in this city. The house scheduled to be demolished at 6 in the morning by a crew that had been moved up at Lizette's direction. He said, "Dale, the demolition is cancelled. Permanently. The property is not for sale. The commercial development is not happening. Call the buyers, call the crew, cancel everything. Yes, I am certain. Yes, I understand. No, I do not need to think about it. Cancel everything." He hung up. He looked at Zora. She was looking at him with that careful, watchful expression, reading him, taking the measure of what she had just witnessed. He straightened his jacket and said, "I need you to stay here today. I need you to stay in this house while I handle something." She said, "I am not a child. I am coming with you." He looked at her for a long moment. He saw Celestine in her face. He saw himself in her hair. He saw 5 years of survival in her eyes and the specific kind of strength that comes not from never being broken but from being broken and continuing anyway. He said, "I know you are not a child, but I need one day to be your father before everything else changes. Give me today and I will give you the rest of it. Everything. The truth and the justice and all of it. But give me today." She looked at him. Then she sat back down on the bed in her old bedroom. She said, "One day." He nodded. He walked to the door and stopped. He turned back. He looked at the room, at the photographs on the wall, at the bracelet on his daughter's wrist, at the worn jacket and the notebook and the small evidence of a life being lived in the only place she had been able to come home to. He said, "This house is not being touched. Not tomorrow. Not ever. This is your house. It has always been your house." He left. Downstairs, before he walked out the front door, he stood in the kitchen for a moment. He looked at the 2 spoons in the cup on the counter. He thought about his daughter coming home from a sanitation shift in the dark and making herself a meal at this counter in this kitchen in this house because she had nowhere else to go and no one who knew she was alive. He picked up the cup with the 2 spoons and held it for a moment. Then he set it back down exactly where it was. He walked out to where Jones was waiting with the car. Lazette was in the sunroom when he got home. She was sitting with a magazine and a cup of tea, and Gordon was somewhere in the house, and the morning looked ordinary from the outside in the way mornings look ordinary when everything underneath them is about to change. She looked up when he came in. She read something in his face and he watched her do it, watched the slight recalibration behind her eyes, the specific alertness of a person who has been careful for a long time and has learned to read rooms as a matter of survival. She said, "You're back early. How was the property?" He sat down across from her. He said, "Lazette, I need you to put the magazine down." She put it down. She looked at him with an expression that was composed and attentive and giving nothing away. He had loved this quality in her once. The composure, the self-possession. He understood now where it came from and what it had cost. He said, "Zora is alive." The room went quiet in a specific way. He watched her face. He was watching for the sequence, and the sequence came. Shock. Then something that lived in the same neighborhood as fear but was colder and more calculating than fear. Then the calculation beginning, visible if you knew what you were looking for, the rapid internal triage of a person assessing damage and options simultaneously. He had watched her calculate things for 6 years. He recognized the look. And recognizing it in this moment, in response to the news that his daughter was alive, told him everything he needed to know and removed any residue of doubt. He said, "I found her this morning at the house on Audubon Street. She has been living there for 3 months since Celestine died." Lazette said nothing. He said, "She told me about Miss Cleo Marble." Still nothing. The composure was remarkable. He could see how it had held for 6 years. He said, "She told me about the will, about the substance you gave Miss Cleo Marble, about what you told her to do with it." Lazette looked at him with those composed eyes, and he looked back, and he did not look away, and eventually something in her face shifted in a way that was not quite confession but was the acknowledgement that confession was no longer necessary. He said, "You were pregnant with my son when you decided to kill my daughter." The word kill sat in the room between them. She said, "I did what I thought was necessary. For us, for Gordon, for the life we were building. That would have left our son with nothing. You had a daughter from another woman who was going to inherit everything you built. What was I supposed to do? Sit quietly and watch Gordon grow up with nothing while she takes everything?" He said, "You were supposed to talk to me." She said, "You would not have changed the will." He said, "I would have made sure Gordon was provided for. I would have been fair. I would have." She said, "You would have chosen her. You always would have chosen her. She was your first. Your real family. I was always second. Gordon was always second." He looked at her. He had spent 6 years thinking he understood this woman. He understood now that he had understood almost nothing. He said, "You moved the demolition date up. This morning, while I was at that house." Something moved across her face. He said, "You knew I was going there, and you moved the date up to this week." She did not answer. He said, "You have been watching that house. You have known someone was living there, or suspected it, and you wanted it gone." She picked up her teacup with steady hands. He watched those steady hands, the steadiness under pressure, the performance of composure as a survival strategy. He said, "I want you to leave this house today. I want your lawyer to contact my lawyer. I want this done without my daughter having to see your face." She set the cup down. She tried several angles. She was intelligent and she knew him, and she went through the levers in order. Their history, what they had built together. Gordon. She went back to Gordon repeatedly, the way people go back to their strongest argument when the others are failing. What this would do to their son. What it would mean for him to grow up without his mother. What Carver was willing to do to a 6-year-old innocent child in service of a daughter who had survived perfectly well without him for 5 years. He listened to all of it. He said, "Gordon is my son, and I will raise him, and he will be loved, and he will be all right. You forfeited your claim to use him as an argument the morning you gave Miss Cleo Marble that substance." She said, "You are really choosing her. Over everything we built. Over 6 years. Over your own son's mother." He said, "I am choosing the truth. I have always chosen the truth. You counted on me not knowing it. Now I know it." She left. He sat in the sunroom alone for a while after she was gone. The tea was still on the table. The magazine. The ordinary evidence of an ordinary morning in a life that had just ended. Gordon came in from wherever he had been. He was 6 years old, and he moved through rooms the way 6-year-olds move, with total commitment to whatever the current activity was, which appeared to be a small blue car that he was running along the edge of the couch. He looked up and saw his father's face and slowed down. He came and stood beside him. He put his small hand on Carver's arm with the specific directness of a child who has not yet learned not to reach for people. He said, "Is everything okay, Daddy?" Carver looked at this boy, his son, who had done nothing wrong, who was the innocent product of a calculation he had not known was being made, who deserved none of what was coming and all of what a father could give. He said, "Things are going to change. But you are going to be all right." Gordon said, "Is Mommy coming back?" Carver said, "Your mother loves you. That is always going to be true. But some things are going to be different now, and I need you to trust me that different is not the same as bad." Gordon thought about this with the serious face he made when he was thinking. Then he said, "Are we still a family?" Carver thought about Zora sitting on the bed in her old bedroom, waiting. He thought about Celestine in a small house in Canada, keeping a secret for 5 years to keep a daughter safe. He thought about Miss Cleo Marble at a graveside, mourning a death she had prevented, saying nothing. He said, "We are going to become a bigger family than you knew you had." Gordon did not fully understand this. He accepted it the way children accept things, with a completeness that adults have spent years learning to withhold. He said, "Can I have cereal?" Carver laughed. It came out of him before he could shape or manage it. A real laugh, uncontrolled, unexpected. rising up from somewhere that had been closed off for 5 years. Gordon looked at him with mild surprise and then laughed too, because laughter is contagious to 6-year-olds, and he did not need to know the reason for it. Carver got up and made his son cereal. He drove back to Audubon Street in the late afternoon. Zora was sitting on the porch steps when he turned onto the block. She stood when she saw his car. He could see her reading him from a distance. She watched the way he moved, determining from his posture and his pace what had happened and what kind of man was walking toward her. He got out of the car and walked up the front path. She said, "Did you choose the truth?" He said, "It cost me everything. I would do it again." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face changed. Not a collapse, not a dramatic opening, not the thing you see in movies where people throw themselves at each other and music plays. Something quieter and more real. A door opening carefully, in a face that had learned to keep doors closed. She said, "I have been watching you for 3 months. From across streets, from parking lots, from bus stops, trying to decide if you were worth the risk." He said, "And," she said, "and you sat on the floor." He did not fully understand what she meant, and then he did. He had not managed the moment when he saw her. He had not performed composure or competence or the version of himself that the world required. He had sat on the floor of her old bedroom, and he had been exactly what he was, which was a man undone, and she had seen it and she had decided that it was real. He sat beside her on the porch steps, not close enough to be presumptuous, close enough to be present. He said, "I want to ask you about Miss Cleo Marble." She looked at him. He said, "I want to know everything. Her full name, where she lived, whether she had family, what she said to you the night she saved you. I want to know everything about her." Zora told him. She told him Miss Cleo Marble's full name, which was Cleophas Adeline Marble, and that she had lived her whole life in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans in a house that had belonged to her mother before her. She told him she had a daughter in Baton Rouge and 2 grandchildren she had photographs of on her mantel. She told him that on the night she saved Zora, in the car driving to the airport, she had held her hand and said only 2 things. She had said, "You are going to be all right," and then later, at the gate, before she turned to go back, she had said, "Your father is a good man who made a bad choice. That is not the same as a bad man. Remember that." Carver sat on the porch steps with his daughter beside him, and he reflected on those words. Your father is a good man who made a bad choice. An elderly woman who had every reason to be bitter about the world had looked at the situation clearly and separated the failure from the person and passed that specific gift to a 13-year-old girl who was about to spend 5 years needing it. He picked up his phone. He called his lawyer. He called a private investigator. He called the director of the Zora Tureaud Foundation, the foundation he had established in his daughter's name 2 years after the funeral, which had been funding arts programs in New Orleans schools for 3 years, and which was about to have its purpose significantly and permanently expanded. He said to each of them, "I need to find the family of a woman named Cleophas Adeline Marble. She lived in the Treme. She is deceased. She has a daughter in Baton Rouge. Find them. I will explain when you do." He hung up and looked at Zora. She was watching him with the bracelet turning slowly on her wrist. He said, "She deserves to be known. What she did deserves to be known. I am going to make sure her family understands what she gave up for you. I am going to make sure her name is said publicly and specifically, and that what she did is honored in a way that matches the scale of it." Zora said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She would have said it was nothing. She would have said she only did what was right." He said, "That is what makes it everything." The evening came down over New Orleans the way evenings come down in October, quickly and warmly. The sky going from blue to gold to the specific purple that the city does better than anywhere else in the world. They sat on the porch steps together and he asked her about her mother. She talked about Celestine quietly. The small house. The winters that Zora had never gotten used to coming from New Orleans. The way Celestine had kept a garden even in Canada, growing the same herbs she had always grown, as if some part of her was always still home. The way she had talked about New Orleans constantly. Every dish she cooked, every story she told, rooted in this city and this street and the life she had lived here before everything was taken from her. She said, she was not bitter. I used to think she should have been. She had so much to be bitter about. But she was not. She missed you sometimes. I could tell even when she did not say it. She missed the person you were before. He said, I am not that person anymore. She said, I know. But she believed you could find your way back to something close to him. He said, do you believe that? She looked at him on the porch in the evening light. The man who had sat on her floor. The man who had canceled the demolition and confronted Lazette and driven back across the city in the late afternoon just to sit beside her on these steps. She said, I am starting to. He told her about the will. He told her it had been written when she was small and that he had never changed it because changing it would have required accepting she was gone, and he had never fully accepted that. He told her it still stood. He told her that whatever legal process Lazette had set in motion, the will was the will, and his daughter was alive, and everything that had always been hers was still hers. She went mute for a moment. Then she said, I did not come back to New Orleans for money. He waited. She said, I came back because I needed to know if my father was someone worth coming back to. I had been watching you for 3 months trying to answer that question. I watched you go to work. I watched you go to church. I watched you take Gordon to the park on Saturday mornings. I watched you leave flowers at a grave with my name on it on the anniversary of my death. He said nothing. She said, I needed to see who you were when you thought no one was watching. Before I decided whether to let you see me. He said, and what did you decide? She said, I decided to fix a loose gate latch on the front fence of this house. A few weeks ago, I told myself I was just maintaining the property. But I came and I fixed the latch that has been broken since I was 12 years old. And then I came back the next week and pulled some weeds along the front path. He looked at the front fence. The latch. He had noticed the path. She said, I was leaving evidence. In case you came. I think I wanted you to find me. I just needed it to feel like fate so I would not have to be afraid of what it meant. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, I am glad I came back to this house. She said, so am I. They went inside when it got dark. He made dinner in the kitchen of the house he had been about to demolish, using what was in the refrigerator, which was not much but was enough. She sat on the counter the way she used to sit on this counter when she was small, and he remembered this without saying it out loud. They ate at the kitchen table and talked. Not about Lazette. Not about the legal proceedings that were coming. Not about the 5 years or the will or the foundation or any of the practical structures of the enormous thing that had just happened. They talked about small things. New Orleans. Music. A restaurant on Magazine Street that had opened since she left and that she had walked past and wanted to try. A book on her desk she had been reading. The fact that she was apparently excellent at her sanitation route and had been given a bigger territory last month, which she said with a dry humor that reminded him of himself and made him feel something too large for any available word. Later, when the dishes were done, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. She said, I have one more question. He said, ask it. She said, Gordon, your son. I need to know how you are going to handle this. Not the legal part, the human part. He said, what do you mean? She said, he is 6 years old and none of this is his fault. I know what his mother did. I have had 5 years to think about what his mother did. But he is 6 years old and he did not choose his mother any more than I chose mine. I need to know that you understand that. He looked at his daughter. At the specific maturity in a face that had no reason to be generous and had chosen it anyway. He said, I am bringing him here tomorrow. If you are willing. She said, I am willing. He said, he asks a lot of questions. He is relentless about it. He gets that from me. She said, I know. I have been watching him at the park on Saturdays. He said, you watched Gordon. She said, I watched my father take his son to the park every Saturday morning and push him on the swings and buy him a snow cone and sit on a bench and watch him play. And I thought, that is the father I lost. That is what was taken from me. But I also thought, that boy did not take it from me. That boy is just a boy on a swing. Carver sat with this for a long time. Then he said, he is going to be your brother. Whatever that looks like. Whatever pace you set. However long it takes. He is going to be your brother and you are going to be his sister and I am going to be both of your fathers. That is what is true now. She nodded. She said good night and went upstairs to her room. He sat in the front room for a while after she went up. In the quiet of the house that he had been about to demolish. In the house his daughter had come home to. He sat with all of it, with Miss Cleo Marble and Celestine and Lazette and 5 years of grief that was real even though its cause had been manufactured, and the specific gift of a morning that had started as a business decision and become the most important morning of his life. He thought about an elderly woman returning to this house on the morning after saving a child, making coffee in this kitchen, serving breakfast to the woman who had tried to use her as a weapon, carrying a secret alone for years until she died. Doing all of this without payment or acknowledgement or the knowledge that it would be honored. He said her name out loud in the empty room. Cleophas Adeline Marble. He said it the way you say the name of someone who deserved more than the world gave them, and whom the world is now going to know about whether it is ready or not. Gordon arrived the following afternoon. He came into the house with his small blue car in his hand and the specific energy of a 6-year-old who has been in a car for 20 minutes and is ready to be somewhere. He stopped in the front room and looked around with wide eyes at a house he had never been in. Then he saw Zora. She was standing at the base of the stairs. She had changed out of her work clothes and she was wearing a blue shirt and her hair was down, the white streak visible above her left ear. Gordon looked at her. He looked at his father. He looked at Zora again. He crossed the room and stood directly in front of her with the complete lack of social hesitation that belongs only to 6-year-olds and looked up at her streak and then pointed at his father's head. He said, "You have the same thing." Zora said, "I do." He said, "How come?" She said, "Because we got it from the same place." Gordon thought about this with his serious thinking face. Then he looked at his father again and back at Zora and processed the information with the specific efficiency of a child who has not yet learned to complicate simple things. He said, "So you are my sister." Not a question. A statement. The flat declarative certainty of a person who has looked at the evidence and reached the only available conclusion. Zora looked at this boy, Lizette's son. The child his mother had been carrying when she arranged for Zora's death. The innocent living proof of everything that had been stolen from her and everything that had been built in its place. 6 years old with his father's eyes and a small blue car in his hand. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, I am your sister." Gordon nodded. He accepted this with the completeness that children accept things, fully and without qualification. He said, "Do you want to see my car? It goes really fast on wood floors." Zora said, "Show me." He got down on his knees on the hardwood and sent the small blue car racing across the room and looked up at her with absolute delight when it went far, and she sat down on the floor beside him, in the house that had almost been demolished, and she watched it go. Carver stood in the doorway between the front room and the hallway and watched his children on the floor together. A daughter who had survived 5 years alone and chosen generosity anyway. A son who had been born into a lie and who was too young and too innocent to be anything other than entirely himself. The house was full of the sound of a small blue car on hardwood and a 6-year-old explaining its aerodynamics and a young woman asking questions and genuinely listening to the answers. Outside, New Orleans went on being New Orleans. Loud and alive and indifferent to any individual miracle. Down the street, someone was playing music. Somewhere further, a streetcar. The city breathing in and out the way it always had and always would, in its own time, on its own terms. Inside, on a street in New Orleans, in a house that had been locked for 5 years and almost demolished and chosen as a home by a girl who had nowhere else to go, a family was beginning. Not without damage. Not without the weight of what had been lost and what had been done and what could never be fully returned. A father who had made choices he would spend years reckoning with. A daughter who had survived things she should never have had to survive. A little boy who would grow up and eventually ask questions that would require honest answers. But beginning, slowly and imperfectly and for real, Miss Cleo Marble had made this possible. An elderly woman who switched a substance and simulated a death and drove a girl to an airport and pressed an envelope of savings into her hands and went back to work the next morning and said nothing. She had made this possible, and she had never asked for anything in return, and her name was Cleophas Adeline Marble, and her daughter in Baton Rouge was going to hear it spoken with the full weight of what it deserved, and the foundation that had been running in the wrong name for 3 years was going to be renamed, and there was going to be a permanent record somewhere in this city of what one human being did for another because she could not do otherwise. That was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was what was possible, and possible was where you started. Carver Tureaud sat down in the front room of the house. His daughter had come home too and watched his children play on the floor. For the first time in 5 years, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Some families are built in the light, where everyone can see them forming. Others are built in the dark, through loss and silence and the long ache of being kept apart. But on that morning, with Gordon at the door and Zora standing just inside it, the house no longer felt like a place where something had been buried. It felt like a place where something had been returned. Not the life they should have had. The life they still had time to begin. Thank you for watching. Before you go, leave a comment and tell us, what would you have done in Miss Cleo Marble's place? See you in the next story.